Hello everybody, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to the last part of our series Human Rights in Times of Crisis, Resistance and Concrete Utopia. As you might have observed, we have already organized a couple of talks about things like the global right to health, like ecology, climate change and human rights, and lately also about feminism and human rights. The idea was actually to have a conference in person and to discuss the kind of multiple crises, and that was already before the coronavirus came up. It was in 2019, and already there we had been observing a multiple complex global crisis, economic crisis, growing violence of men against women and children, but also obviously the climate change and environmental destruction, and lately the pandemic. So one might think that this looks like a very dystopian vision, but at the same time activists, artists, experts, but also some lawyers are breaking with the established and designing countermodels for the future. People are taking the streets for their rights and those of others, and human rights organizations have expanded their repertoire to include legal action. Nevertheless, more would be necessary and more would be possible. And this is why we called our series in the subtitle Resistance and Concrete Utopias. One concrete utopia is definitely enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Declaration offers a rich treasure of freedoms, but also of social, economic, and cultural rights, individual as well as collective rights. But nevertheless, this program must be sharpened, and the human rights community must reach out to other communities, must take up other topics. Therefore, we're saying that human rights work must refer to the prevailing and growing inequality, the underpinning social questions, as well as be conceived decolonial, feministic, and ecologically. And here we are by today's event. So we have Mina Jagannath, who used to work as a lawyer in Miami, but is now has moved to New York and is an advisor to the. She runs the global network of the Movement Lawyers Lab, and she will explain a little bit later what that means. We have Sima Leupert here, who just arrived from Namibia, and I will introduce her in a little bit more in a later moment. And to my right is Vince Warren, also from New York, the executive director of the Center for Constitutional Right, a long-standing partner organization of my organization, the ECCHR. So decolonization, that's the overdue reappraisal of colonialism, an absolute antithesis to human dignity and human rights, and we will come back to that. This decolonization, it's strange to even spell that out, but it's not yet on the agenda of many human rights organizations. It's not yet on the agenda of the legal community, and this is an overdue task, because decolonization should become a genuine human rights task. And that refers to a lot of different questions. Decolonization is not only addressing colonial crimes in the past, and we will come back to that when we talk about the German genocide in Namibia, as well as slavery in the US. It's also about decolonizing the law and researching the role of law in legitimizing imperialism and colonialism. So actually the history of international law can be read as the history of imperialism and colonialism. So that's a genuine task of the lawyer. But it's also about decolonizing the relations between northern and southern based human rights organization, and to come to a more cooperative practice. So we have a long agenda for today, and I would like to start with you, Sima. I hope you're fine here in dark and cold Berlin. So welcome again. And so Sima, you are an advisor to the Nama Traditional Leaders Association, and you're as well a descendant of the victims. So would you like to share some personal remarks with us about your own history and your family's history?
Yes. Yes, yeah, I've shared this story so many times, but yeah, my own grandmother was born in a concentration camp. Her mother, my great-grandmother, is a survivor of Shark Island, was subjected there to scraping of skulls. When the concentration camp of Shark Island was closed in 1908, the prisoners were moved to sort of satellite concentration camps where they were to serve as slave labor for the new settlers that had now confiscated all the land. And my great-grandmother was rented out to a German settler. And yeah, this is where my grandmother was mothered, was born and fathered by this German settler. And so, yeah, that is my reality. When we were young, my grandmother always used to talk about the island, and but we never realized, you know, what this island is. It's only when you grow up and you sort of read and you start to make sense of what the elders were whispering, that you are putting together all the pieces of the puzzle. So yeah, this is who I am. I remember my great-grandmother as a very, very frail old woman who was she didn't like being around people. You know, she was a very secluded kind of person which I found very, very strange. But I can relate to that now, since we, you know, as you grow older, you make all of these together. So that's my personal history. Being a activist in the genocide struggle is not something that you do by choice. It becomes a necessity because you yourself need to find yourself, who you are, where you come from. You need to start making sense of all of that. And so being involved in and also the realities that you live in now are the realities that were created by this genocide. So it is not something that you, even in my generation, something that you have escaped. So you start to ask yourself, but why is it that only a specific group of people or groups of people find themselves in this situation? And yeah, that's my personal background and how I too became involved in activism, particularly when I was asked by the Nama traditional leaders, by the chiefs, to mainly support them with international lobby work, you know, to get more solidarity networks and to really work towards the struggle as a universal struggle for reparations. And so this is where my main focus is, but also just to look at, while the political work continues, what are the legal options that are open to us to take on this fight. So that's just a little bit about me.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very personal story, which brings us right to the point, because I mean, we're talking about a genocide which happened between 1904 to 1908. And now we're probably for the first time, a broader public is aware of this genocide, and the broader public is discussing how to acknowledge the genocide and how to pay reparation. And this is only due to your struggle, the struggle of the Nama people as well as the Herero people. And we are 3 lawyers here. Actually, the trigger for many actions were lawsuits in the US. Lawsuits that later have been lost but lawsuits that brought the genocide on the agenda. And that led to negotiations between the two governments. Then the post-independent Namibian government. Namibia gained its independence in the same year as Germany became united in 1990. And but even since that time, since 1990, it was not the governments who took action. None of the two governments approached the other to discuss. It was the two communities. And at some point in 2015, the two governments started to negotiate and came up this summer with a government agreement, which is not yet ratified, neither in the Namibian nor in the German government. And this agreement bears a lot of big weaknesses. One is we could observe already in the last year, it was only government delegations who discussed with each other, and so a majority of the Nama and in the Ovaherero constituency, so those people who were affected by the genocide were not part of the negotiations, which is a clear breach of many international treaties, including the UN Convention on the Rights of Indigenous People, but also many other. And also what we see now, that Germany wants to acknowledge the genocide, and that's at least something. In difference to other colonial nations, they acknowledge that from nowadays legal perspective, we can say this was a genocide, but they don't want to acknowledge the legal obligations. So they wouldn't use the word reparations. It's a kind of extended development aid that they subscribe to. It's 1.1 billion euro, which they want to pay over the last years. So this agreement has been strongly criticized by some civil society organizations here, but mainly by your organizations in Namibia. So would you like to share a little bit of your critique? How did you perceive the whole process, and how did you and others react to in this summer to the agreement?
Yeah, I think right at the start it must be clear that both the Namibian governments and the German government never had any intention whatsoever to ever talk about any genocide. It is only because the Nama and the Ovaherero people put pressure on them to do so. And if the Nama and Ovaherero people didn't push for this, then nothing would have happened. I think this is also very evident in a agreement that was all the time denied by the German government. We had been raising this issue a lot of times with the German embassy and with various German representatives, and we've been asking even the Namibian government about a decision that was made between the SWAPO party shortly before independence, right at the turn of independence around 1989, and this has always been denied. But suddenly when the joint declaration now became known to the public, the 1989 agreement and the Bundestag resolution that was taken is suddenly now contained in this joint declaration, something that had been denied by both governments in the past. So it's very clear that even before independence, there had already been some sort of whether it's a gentleman's agreement or whether it's a written agreement or whatever it may have been, there was some sort of understanding between the new ruling party that would take over as the Namibian government and the German authorities, that there wouldn't be any discussion about this, and that Namibia would enjoy some sort of a special a special relationship with Germany. And this is what Germany has always pushed for, and this is what Namibia has always pushed for. And what we have always said is that we will have none of that. Also, secondly, I want to say that I don't see the legal action that we took in New York. I don't see it as a case that we lost. I mean, from my perspective, I see it as a case that we won, because the content of the case, it wasn't so much that it was not argued that a genocide was not committed. However, the court did say that a genocide was committed, but that it cannot be tried in a U.S. court. That was the finding of the court. So in that sense, I think it was an absolute breakthrough for us, you know, to prove that a genocide actually took place. That is the second issue that I want to raise. The third issue that I want to raise is, from our perspective, obviously, you know, in German circles and in other academic circles, people are saying that Germany is now acknowledging a genocide. From our perspective, it hasn't done so. Germany, and also when you have experienced this declaration has almost been a reaffirmation of genocide, just because of the way that this declaration is written. It is such a racist declaration in every sense of the word. In its very undertones, it reaffirms a colonial relationship. It reaffirms a colonial relationship between Namibia and Germany. And so Germany comes to Namibia and says to Namibia, listen, what happened in 1904, if one looks at it, you know, from today's perspective, yes, then it could be called a genocide. And we feel really terrible about what our predecessors did. Therefore, Namibia, take this aid that we are giving you so that we can move on with our lives. And the Namibian government is very ready to accept this patronizing, very altruistic gesture, kind gesture by this paternal figure who deems it very okay to dangle this carrot in front of the eyes of a black government. You know, it's like, give black people some money and let them just keep quiet and let's get on with our lives. From our perspective, that's what it is. It's taking a knife that is already in the flesh, and it is digging that knife a little bit deeper into the flesh. That is what the declaration is for us. I think also what it also does, this declaration, is that it is very reflective of the incompleteness of both the Namibian history as well as the German history. If Germany understands its atrocities, specifically in terms of genocide, it only begins to understand it from the period of the Jewish Holocaust. Anything that happened before that is not part of German history. It is not taught to the German child, it is not talked about by the German public, and it is not supposed to be talked about. Because just what happened in during the Holocaust is so un-German, you know, that needs to be, that part of history needs to be corrected. But everything else that happened is completely fine. And that is why even in the declaration, Germany can say, yes, from today's perspective. But at the time that it happened, we had the legal right to kill you. Because under international law, you were uncivilized people. You were savages. And therefore, we did not commit a crime. So when you look at the declaration, it says we didn't commit a crime. Therefore, we don't really owe you an apology. However, we are going to apologize for what our predecessors did. It is a conditional admission, and therefore any apology that would come would be a conditional apology.
I understand you, Sima, but you yourself made the point that you consider the US lawsuit as a certain success. And please allow me to say that from our point of view, it's also an achievement that you pressured the German government to at least negotiate, and they will apologize and they will acknowledge the genocide. In a way, you described rightly, and I agree with you, but this allows us, lawyers, civil rights groups, civil society actors, to criticize and go deeper. And this going deeper means also, we would say, look, there was this humanitarian standard by the time, and these European nations would only subscribe to this kind of treatment amongst each other, what they call civilized nations, and the not civilized nations were excluded. And that's their interpretation of international law. So your critique of the agreement allows us to make this critique of international law public. So actually it triggers a discussion which was overdue and which wouldn't have been possible without you. So wouldn't you consider that as a political achievement? And I mean, still maintain the critique. And maybe the second question, and also to conclude, to switch to Vince. So the question of the achievement, and the other question is, what do you think are the way forwards? What are your claims? What should be done today?
Yes. I must be very honest. Sitting from where I sit. I would say that it is an opportunity lost. That the whole negotiation process is an opportunity lost, and therefore moving forward, the only thing that would make sense, because we have seen that for this discussion has been going on for 15 years between the two governments. And in those 15 years, we have always been consistent in our demands. And the consistency has always been, allow us to sit at the table. Allow us to be our own negotiators. And also admit to a crime. That is what needs to happen. There needs to be an admission to a crime, and then if there is admission to a crime, then only can there be an apology for the crime. That needs to happen first. If that has not happened, then there is absolutely no way that you can start talking about reparations, and not only reparations, but also not a restitution, but then also a commitment to not allowing this to ever happen again. That is what needs to happen moving forward.
Thank you very much, Sima. Vince, would you like to comment first on this before we talk about the situation in the US and the claims of the Black Lives Matter movement and others?
Yes, I would. And Sima, thank you for both your story and for the well-pitched critique about what negotiation looks like and how it feels and what's actually being negotiated. And there were a couple of things in what you said that I thought were really compelling. One is particularly around the lawsuit in New York, when lawyers might feel like it was a failure because you lost. The movement might see it as a success because it actually raised issues for discussions that had never happened before. And that's, you know, in the movement lawyering work that we do in the US, at the Center for Constitutional Rights, we have a phrase called success without victory. And as you know, human rights lawyers, just getting to the question of, you know, being concrete around building human rights or building some of these issues like colonialism into the human rights framework, a big part of the lawyers, because lawyers don't like to think about cases and strategies that are going to lose. They don't want to file them. It makes them look bad. It doesn't advance the cause. But that's when lawyers are thinking just as lawyers. But when you think about lawyering on behalf of, in support of a movement where the political goals are very different very often than the legal goals, that's when you get these moments of success. And I'm wondering what it would look like in the United States. I would venture to say that the United States court would be less likely to call U.S. slavery a genocidal project than they would to call the Namibian genocide a genocide. And that says a lot about how the law operates, how as a protectionist framework, and also that U.S. courts can be relied on to hold perhaps other countries to account, but cannot be relied on to hold itself to account. And I think another thing that I wanted to say was that, and I'll get to this shortly, is that in the United States, the movement for Black Lives and COBRA, a range of groups, some of whom that have formed recently, some of which have been around for generations, have come to agreement on several principles around reparations. And one that I find compelling, which you also mentioned, is not just a cessation of continuing violations, but making sure that these don't happen again in the future, which is a very, very difficult task for a government to commit to, much less comprehend. And it's a very difficult task for the politicians that are involved in negotiations to commit to, even comprehend, but it is essential for the continued survival. Last thing is another piece that is very resonant in the US context around reparations is the intergenerational trauma. And so listening to your story about your grandmother, your great-grandmother, and the work that's happening now, it becomes very clear to all of us that it's, in some ways, none of this has happened in the past. Looking at it in a timeline in that context only misses the point of what's happening. These are continuing violations. Even when people say that we're sorry, even when they're in the context of negotiation, they continue until they don't. And that's the key part about reparations.
No, that's a very interesting point, but it needs to be made, you know, because people don't understand it. It needs, so I'm sorry for you, Sima, that you have to tell this story over and over again. But for many people, it's just a frozen piece of the past. And so I think it needs explanation, and it needs to be written down in school books and to be discussed in universities. That we're talking about post-colonial injustice. And this includes also, and that's a question which completely spared out of this agreement, but I guess this is also the case in the US. The agreement with Namibia didn't discuss the land question, although the Germans and later on also the South African colonizers took away the fertile land of the Ovaherero and Nama people. It doesn't discuss the question of access to natural resources, and it doesn't hold those accountable who profited from the colonial period. And here we are with your discussions in the US, and can you give us a little bit of an insight of how the question of reparation for slavery is now discussed. We know that there were important articles, there were initiatives in the Congress. Black Lives Matter put it on the as a claim. But how is this? How does this discussion develop?
Yeah, and it's a good question. And you know, we have to acknowledge that it's a different colonial context depending on who the oppressed people are. So if we were talking about it in the context of indigenous people, first peoples in the United States, and the colonizing of their culture and their lands, and and enslavement of indigenous people, that's one set of harms. That also needs to be a part of the conversation. And what's wonderful about the Black Lives Matter movement is that they are completely focused on black people, but they do it in an intersectional way so that they not only acknowledge, but they also build alliances with indigenous people, with First Peoples around those questions. Because if a scenario in which everything was made wonderful and perfect for black people in the United States, the descendants of African slaves, would do nothing, would do little to address the fundamental problem, which was what happened before. I would say that I would have my comments this way. I would tell the story backwards. So the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, it's clearly galvanized the world. It's galvanized movements around the world. Young folks are rising up and employing some of the same frameworks, the same tactics as the Black Lives Matter movement. But people would make the mistake that Black Lives Matter is just a response to the current state of police violence. And that's when people think that they begin to lose the longer colonial and post-colonial thread. And so it comes from from the first experience of black people in the United States, the 10.7 million people that were enslaved, the 2 million people that died on the boats coming to the United States by murder, by suicide, by starvation, by disease. That was a foundational element that really set the experience of everybody, including myself, that's descended from folks that were brought here on slave ships. And you know, in looking at U.S. history, the transatlantic slave trade was abolished in 1808, but that didn't stop the U.S. slave trade. And in fact, what would happen is that because the new importation of enslaved people was cut off, there was a massive and systemic effort to force women to have babies, to rape women, and to separate families in order to populate the enslaved population. Those aren't very often, they're thought about as discrete acts, but they really are part of the systemic problem that Black Lives Matter organizers are talking about today. So when we talk about the very high, outrageous child mortality rate and mortality rate for black women who are giving childbirth, it is a direct line to the way black women's bodies were treated by the system of slavery. Two, that the system of slavery ended, and it was then followed by 100 years of racial terror, particularly in the American South through the Ku Klux Klan, state-sanctioned action. Even after that was over, or after it abated and the civil rights movement, it was then followed by the so-called war on drugs, which was a political move to begin to essentially criminalize black and brown people. And now mass incarceration, police violence, economic disenfranchisement, and so on. So for the Black Lives Matter activists, the idea of reparations are not just about defunding the police. They are about addressing all of those harms, because this generation understands better than I think my generation did what intergenerational, not only harm looks like, but intergenerational trauma. I think folks in my generation, I'll speak for myself, I've been so traumatized that I've actually moved to try to use the master's tools, become a lawyer, to do all these types of things in order to to fix things, and I'm glad that I did, but the younger generation, they're not putting up with that. Frankly, they're not even putting up with people in my generation that are looking at it, and that's what's so exciting about it. So when you think about the reparations that are being called for, it's not just money, although it all costs money and it all takes political will. It's addressing the badges and indicia of slavery, so not just the past acts, but everything that enslaved people and their descendants have had to endure because of that original manifestation. Cessation of continuing violations, as we were talking about, guarantees of non-repetition, divest and invest, taking the resources that we have, divesting from the systems like the prison industrial complex, the policing system, the lack of educational opportunities, and investing those instead of in oppressive systems in the people that are descendants of enslaved people. Intergenerational trauma, as we talked about, and also restitution. Restitution meaning restoring the survivors of the genocidal project to the state that they were in before the genocidal project. And here's where we run into the problem, because I'll speak for the United States. The United States political system not only will not, but cannot acknowledge that there was a point in which black people were free, that they were free to farm their land, that they were free to live in communities, they were free to thrive. This United States system is based solely on the idea of the criminality and inferiority of black people. All of our systems are designed to take corrective action for our inherent inferiority. And so getting to the question of reparations is very, very difficult, because the acknowledgement of the basic crime has to happen first, and they are incapable of doing that without being pushed by civil society.
It's a very interesting point, because when we were 2 years ago, we had a series of events in Windhoek and Swakopmund in Namibia, ECCHR and organizations like CIMAS, and we had Makau Mutwa speaking there, and then in his speech he made the point, he asked the rhetorical question, can the Germans ever accept the Ovaherero, Nama and other black Namibians as equal? Can they ever accept them as equals? And he said the answer lies in how Germans react to the questions of genocide and reparation. So here we are. And so we just could replace, US American system through and black Americans. So this is, and I found it particularly interesting, and I want to repeat it, this question of intergenerational trauma. That is something that people wouldn't understand, and I think people need to understand. So you explained us the fundamental importance of this whole discussion, but you're also involved as an organization in very concrete struggles around post-colonial injustices like police violence, etc., etc. So could you give us a little bit of an insight in that?
Sure. And we are, so the Center for Constitutional Rights has been using litigation as a tool around police violence, police harassment, and more importantly, suppression and control of black communities. And so in New York, there was the Stop and Frisk program that has operated for generations. And we had a successful litigation. We did a 9.5-week trial in which we won on the issue that the New York City Police Department policy violated the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution around equal treatment and the 4th Amendment article around searches and seizures. Now, that we can get back into that success-failure question, because that's a situation where the legal field would say clearly we have succeeded, and yet it has not done much to eradicate. It may have ameliorated some things, but has not done much to eradicate that challenge. We've been doing a lot more work in the South, in the southern United States, and particularly working with black communities around their lands. And this is where the land question gets interesting, because after slavery ended, a number of black folks bought their land, bought the land that they were on, and of course they spent generations trying to keep it. That land was being stolen. More recently, what's been happening is and this relates to environmental and corporate work. Petrochemical plants are proliferating only in black communities. There's a big grain elevator that they want to put in a black community. The Formosa chemicals plant, plastics plant from Taiwan, starting to build $1 billion plastics plant on the burial site of enslaved Africans. In Louisiana.
Yeah.
In Louisiana, sorry.
Yeah,
yes.
you know, you have to come up tomorrow, because you are now in Berlin, because we work together with Forensic Architecture in a new project called Investigative Commons, and one of their projects is exactly to research this continuation of post-colonial injustice in the region of Louisiana.
Well, so this is good, and so I would actually very much want to do that. And I think the point that I would want to make, I think, aside from what we're doing, is that if we've just made the connection between how the German government and the United States government are disinclined, disabled in some way from acknowledging what is happening, what we've done is we've created a framework for how post-genocidal oppression works. Mm-hmm. And that makes it ripe for human rights analysis, that we don't have to look at these as horrible humanitarian tragedies. We can look at these things as actual crimes that need to be acknowledged, they need to be ameliorated, they need to be eradicated, and the victims need to be, and the descendants need to be made whole. Now that is a human rights project. I'm not so sure why people are not doing that.
You have not to point to us, because we're taking this up. But I was wondering, and I want to, this is my last question to you, because we wait Mina too long. But recently a report was published of the UN Special Rapporteur on Transitional Justice, and he exactly made this point, you know, the already very developed toolbox of transitional justice, why did nobody apply it to colonial crimes? And here we are again. But my question would to you, why did human rights organization and legal organization didn't take this up? I mean, why only now? And why only UN bodies and some weird organizations like ours?
Organizers, oppressed people and victims, by definition, are visionaries, because when you live under the conditions that people live in, you have to be able to, you can only move forward if you can imagine a better world and if you can articulate the things that need to change. The problem with the human rights legal community is that there are not a lot of visionaries. You are one, sir, but there are not a lot of them. A lot of them are functionaries. And so there are three reasons why this hasn't been taken up. Number one is because the politics are so difficult that it makes lawyers feel that politically they won't be able to win. The courts tend to be conservative and makes lawyers think that they'll never win. And because the lawyers are not visionaries, that they would rather work within the framework that exists rather than pushing the framework. And what we need are more lawyers that would push the framework to take those risks. We have huge debates about whether we should or should not do things in our community, which is fantastic. But it's the vision and taking that risk. The question is, what does a lawyer have to lose if oppressed communities have anything to gain? And in human rights frameworks, we don't always ask those questions.
That was more than a comprehensive question. And talking about visionary lawyers, we are we now are eager to listen to you, Mina Jagannath. You worked a lot of time in Miami and did very concrete work. Why don't you explain us a little bit what you did there with the Haitian and the Black and other communities?
Well, before getting there, I would just love to comment on this conversation, just because I think I really thought what Sima was saying about the preconditions necessary for reparations to even happen. It's so applicable across the board. It makes me think about the sort of panoply of things that are necessary for transitional justice to take place. It's, you know, recovering a history. It's an apology. It's actually telling that story and teaching it to future generations. That actually constitutes a true acknowledgement of the harm that has happened and a commitment to move forward from that. I think it's so clear that you know, sort of the colonial injustices of slavery. Are you able to hear me?
Maybe you can
I'm not sure.
repeat the last two sentences.
Okay. I may turn off my video. Would that be better? Yeah. Okay. Let me turn off my video. So and I apologize for this, but you know, it's clear that what I was saying was that it's very interesting what Vince was saying, what we were commenting on about ongoing coloniality in the U.S. You know, both from slavery and then also the robbing of indigenous people of their lands and the injustices committed against First Nation people in the U.S. You know, I think we see what we saw in Miami, for example, is you know, just a continuation of that. And we see that playing out in the geography. And you know, for example, one of the issues that we worked on a lot is around gentrification and land issues. And what's interesting about Miami is that there were Jim Crow laws in place, and Black people were allowed to live on the coast. They were allowed to like on Miami Beach, where you know, there were the nice hotels where the parties were happening. Only white folks were able to live there, but they would have Black entertainers come in to play music, but then afterwards they had to go back over to the other side of the segregation wall. Now when we see you know, sort of the geography of Miami, we see Black people living in if you overlay like the economics map on that, you see that the sort of poorest neighborhoods in Miami are populated by Black folks, and the coast continues to be white. And but with, you know, sea level rise and climate situations, the warming of the climate, we see that in fact the land that Black folks were forced to live on in the past is actually on higher ground. And so now we see a situation where the neighborhoods that you know, that none of the white folks wanted to live on is now some of the more valuable land, because the coasts are being threatened by hurricanes, sea level rise, flooding, and you see a sort of a new wave of I would say colonization. You know, you have a new wave of people buying up the land that was now historically populated by Black folks, because it is becoming the you know, sort of the resource that is coveted in this in the context of climate change. But and so for us as lawyers, I mean, the way that we operated was to say, okay, like in this dynamic, we need to take advantage of the democratic space that exists for people to make their demands and fight for greater rights and self-determination, and have help people navigate, you know, the planning and zoning, like help people navigate those processes so that they can actually have a say in what their future community looks like. And I would argue that within all of these systems, even as a human rights lawyer, I think one of the things that's most important is, you know, not to kind of work within the confines of what the law says you can do, but actually to try to push these institutions and push these systems to acknowledge the actual demands that are being made. So for example, like when we went to Geneva after the killing of Mike Brown, we submitted a shadow report to the UN Committee Against Torture during the treaty body review of the US with the parents of Michael Brown, as well as the activists in Ferguson. We knew that forum wouldn't necessarily, accept everything that the community was demanding and wouldn't necessarily echo what it was that we wanted. But we also knew that to go to the UN to speak before the Committee Against Torture, to speak on the world stage would provide a platform that where people could speak their injustices. There's a way in which legal forums, while they're usually not designed to allow the full story to come through, we as human rights lawyers can actually facilitate the process of storytelling, of correcting the narrative, of making sure that the people who are most directly impacted are able to tell their stories and also put forth the solutions that they think are necessary in order to repair the harm that has been done. And so that's why I think what we are talking about is so important here, because I think that we the human rights, as Vince was saying, the human rights field has historically, not been not at the forefront of necessarily speaking, not necessarily, saying the truth of what happens. Like we tend to kind of be more reactive, and yet I think that there's a lot of opportunity, and in fact, if the human rights system is going to continue to be a system that movements use, we have to be more brave in the way that we accompany communities.
It's very interesting, Mina, what you're saying, that you're kind of pointing to new initiatives towards the UN, while people tend to forget that there is a long history of Namibians, black Namibians, going to the UN, and even in the 40s already, the first claims regarding reparations for the genocide, in the German genocide, were made at the UN, and also the civil rights movements in the US, including the Black Panther Party and Malcolm X, always used the UN as a political but also legal forum, and Malcolm X himself was pointing to the fact that black rights are human rights. And so it's a very interesting reconnecting to a more political vision, while the functionaries of human rights, as you called them, have forgotten to connect to this political vision. So Mina, you heard Vince talking about the Black Lives Matter movement and the reparation question. How do you perceive the discussion around police violence? Has anything, many people connected to that, many people heard about it, but more than a year later, I think it's interesting also for many people to hear about what has something changed. From your perspective, have you achieved something, and if so, what is it?
Well, I asked myself this question as the uprisings were happening last year, and it was interesting because it was about, over 5 years since the uprisings in Ferguson, and I reflected on how much did we truly achieve in that time. If George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, if these police killings continue to happen, and as the uprisings were unfolding, and the demand of defund the police, or the demand to divest from these harmful institutions and invest in care and healing and food and basic needs of people, as those demands started coming forward, it made me think that, you know, even though in 2014 and 15, it seemed like the people in power were not listening, and that you know, the what we were able to achieve didn't feel didn't feel like big enough victories, or it didn't feel like it actually completely acknowledged the full force of the demands. I see that my connection isn't. I'm going to turn off my video
now
again.
it's
Sorry
okay.
about that.
It's okay now. Whatever.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about this. We'll see. Hopefully it'll stay fine. Even though it seemed like those in power were not listening to the demands, I hearing young people almost you know, able to articulate exactly what it was that we were talking about in the uprisings of last year, it made me think, okay, even if the people in power are not listening, young people are listening, people, the broader public is listening, and it is always important to make the demands that we think are necessary in order to address the injustices that have happened. And we, it is not our job as lawyers to dampen those. It's our job as lawyers to say, okay, like, how can we use the tools of a law to create space for you to make these demands, to create space for you to explain what was a harm that happened and what is needed in to arrest and so, you know, I think that we are still a far ways away from truly dealing with you know, the really deep rooted systemic problems that allow for police violence to happen and to continue to happen. But I think that the you know, this full range of things that we've been talking about, apologies, historical memory, teaching history and teaching the truth to young people, continued protests when these things do happen, and then yes, reparations as well. I think all of those things are necessary in order for us to truly acknowledge this. And I would also argue that it is a global process. I mean, yes, you know, we're talking about in the US, we're talking about the history of slavery and what that has done to Black folks in the US, but it is a dynamic that is not analogous to the relationship of formerly colonized people to the colonizing states. You know, the same kind of distrust that you know, Black folks and other people of color have towards police in the US is, as in my experience working in other places, my experience also with India, which is where my family is from, Haiti and other places, is that, you know, people either don't have, and that has been, you know, sort of handed to them by the colonizing power. And I would argue that, you know, a lot of the sort of dysfunctions in the way states work, or states have developed in these formerly colonized countries, is come from the failure to truly address the harms of colonialism, the ways that it has displaced, you know, sort of more indigenous ways of governing, the ways that, you know, it has prevented true self-determination. And unless we actually not just acknowledge the harm, but also acknowledge, you know, that how our institutions are, you know, continue to be tinged and marked by coloniality, we're not going to get to a place where like real justice and human rights for these communities can be realized.
Thank you, Amina. And we're coming back to you and let you talk about a recent initiative of your organization. But I would like to hear a little bit from you, Seema. How do you perceive these two stories from Mina and from Vince about the US? What comes up to your mind when you hear this?
I hear a common thread. I hear a common thread in what I'm saying. From a Namibian perspective, I hear a common thread from what they are saying. And for me, this is about colonial repercussions, you know, and our inability to deal with those repercussions, and our inability to deal with that trauma, and not our inability to look at ourselves in the mirror. Take an example. If Germany, what Germany is doing through this joint declaration in Namibia, for me, is an extension of what it does inside Germany. Because in Namibia, Germany is unable to look into the mirror, and therefore by design, the Nama and the Ovaherero people, it is by design. The Nama and Ovaherero people are not allowed to be at the negotiation table, because if they were at the negotiation table, then Germany would be able to look into the mirror, because these people would then reflect back to Germany what is real, and that Germany is able to face. And it is similar to what happens inside Germany. Is Germany reflecting on anti-blackness in Germany? Is it reflecting on its own relationship with all its former colonies, and where does the what is increasingly becoming a problem, anti-blackness inside Germany, come from? So I'm seeing and young people, I mean, like both speakers were saying, whether we like, I've been in activism since I was 16 years old, and I'm now going for my 60s, and I'm starting to get a little bit tired of this. And but if you look at even what happens not only in the US, but if you see at what happens in Namibia, if you see what happens in Germany, even in other parts of Europe, young people are saying enough is enough. And why are they saying that? And when I was young, I used to say enough is enough. And now my children are saying, and still nothing has been solved. And so from generation to the next generation, you know, this trauma just continues and builds up. And therefore I see that the only way that we can really deal with this is to create these international sort of partnerships, international networks, and move into an international reparations movement, rather than, you know, talking about genocide in Namibia, because the similarities are so there, they are there. It's just that the real issues that we are dealing with are not necessarily the same. And I mean, in the case of Namibia, you are not only dealing with colonialism, because colonialism has got its own issues, but you are also, on top of colonialism, you are dealing with a genocide, you know, and there is a difference between the two. So yeah, this is what I'm hearing, and I don't see any these movements in these different countries able to, you know, to make victories alone, but to do this together. I think this is what I'm hearing from what the two speakers are saying.
Thank you. First of all, obviously I owe you an answer about Germany, and no, it's not enough how Germany reacts not only to anti-black violence and discrimination, but also to anti-Arab, anti-Islamist, and also anti-Semitic violence. It's not enough. So that's the one point I want to make. But it's contested. I mean, that I think is important, and that is something I hear you saying talking about exhaustion and enough is enough. But I would, and this is something I would like to ask all the three of you in the last round. Compared to the situation, let's say 20 or 30 years ago, didn't we go some steps at least? Because maybe, you know, this is something like the way how we imagine justice is a utopian goal which we will never achieve, but it can also paralyze us if we compare the situation from now to this absolute ideal, to this absolute goal. While when we look 20 years ago, I would say the colonialism is on the agenda of so many European actors as never. And so this is a question I have for all of you. But I mean, I want to get back to you, Mina, because I mean, Sima was calling for a global movement for reparation, and one of the obstacles which stands in the way for a global movement and for global encounters is the pandemic, and that's an issue you took up. And I would say this is the current scandalous global vaccination policy and access to vaccines is a continuation of post-colonial injustice we've been talking about. And so our organization, ECCHR, is very well connected with you and with movements, Lawyer Snap, and we took together some initiatives, but maybe you tell us a little bit more about this.
Yeah, and with this, you know, our even before the pandemic, our hunch was that global crises, or our understanding, our analysis was that the things that we experience at a national level are actually global in nature, and so they may manifest differently in each location, but they are connected to global forces that.
Mina, you should talk without the video because you're difficult to understand.
Unfortunate. Okay, so sorry, everybody. So our analysis was that global crises require global solutions, and in order for us to actually address the crises that we're experiencing that are global in nature, we have to be connected to one another across borders and actually deal with these issues in a transnational manner. So what Sima was saying about the necessity for networks and for us to deal with these problems in a global manner is absolutely correct. And it is the reason why we're building the global network of movement lawyers. And so when the pandemic began, and as it started unfolding, we saw actually that this network was of use. The fact that some of us had gotten together already and built relationships across borders was useful, because then we were able to share stories and talk about how it was that we, as lawyers in our respective places, were supporting people in getting what they need. For example, people who are incarcerated, the eviction moratoriums, like on the housing front, for workers. And so we began to start exchanging. And then when the vaccine rollout began, And in particular, when in April, when we saw the way the Delta variant was tearing through India, our colleague Kranti basically came to us. He was a part of multiple networks, the Global Network of Movement Lawyers, as well as the ESCR net and another network, INCLO. He basically said to all of us, he says, well, what are you all doing, human rights lawyers? Isn't this one of the biggest human rights issues that we're facing? How is it that, how are we actually responding to this? And as we began to analyze and talk to people in the Access to Medicines movement, basically activists who had been organized and involved ever since the AIDS HIV pandemic, they said, well, the biggest problem is intellectual property rights, and the way that intellectual property rights are privileged over the human rights of people all around the world. And so we across networks decided to come together to figure out how it is that we can leverage the human rights mechanisms as well as the courts to achieve equitable distribution of vaccines as well as other COVID healthcare. And for us, I think one of those, so there are multiple tracks moving. There are, because the offenders, we could say, or the people, the problematic states, unfortunately, are all in the global north, where vaccines are being hoarded, where pharma companies are, they are determining policy versus sort of human rights or international cooperation being the primary concern. We lawyers from the global north basically got together with lawyers from the global south to say, okay, we're going to support you all in pushing our governments in the US, in Canada, in the UK, Germany, Switzerland, Norway, to say, let's leverage courts, domestic litigation, let's leverage UN treaty bodies, so the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, as well as the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, using UN special procedures, special rapporteurs to put out multiple urgent appeals and petitions that allow us to tell the story and then basically give it back to those institutions to say, okay, yes, these are novel claims.
Sorry, Mina, it's very difficult to get into contact with you. If you were sitting here, you would see that we have only 4 minutes left, and so I would like you to come to an end. It's really a pity that I have to cut you short this way, but
no,
as we have no
okay.
eye contact, it's a difficult task not to be unpolite, but.
No, absolutely. And the one thing that I did want to mention was recently, a couple of weeks ago, we filed to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And, as we were putting that appeal together, there were a lot of conversations about how an appeal of this nature had never been done. Usually it's one state being called to task for violations against people within that country, and there isn't a the sort of transnational claim has never been made. But in the way that we were talking about it before, we said, well, we have to sort of force or not force, but like we have to try to make the claim that we need to make about the about this dynamic of the global north, global south, re-entrenching colonial relationships. It's re-entrenching a racial discrimination at the global level that has its roots in colonialism, and therefore, in order for countries to truly meet their obligations under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, they need to support the waiver of the IP, technology transfer, and doing all the things that are necessary to actually unlock.
Thank you very much, Mina, for introducing this initiative, quite innovative initiative. Vince, you heard Seema's claim for a global reparation movement. You had Mina's new initiative. Would you like to conclude or to add something to that?
Yeah, I would like to answer your question about that you asked for me. And have things changed? Have things changed in the last 20 years? Looking back, things have definitely changed. You asked a question of Mina about Black Lives Matter. What's been what's happened in the last couple of years? And here's the thing. Currently in the United States, state legislators are trying to slip away from the idea of defunding or divesting from the police as a political move. Now, some people will say, well, Black Lives Matter has failed because they haven't gotten those things done. But my kids don't get a cookie every time they ask me. And what we actually should be thinking about is, given the breadth and the depth of the inhumane treatment, do we actually expect the first time that we're going to ask for something that the state is going to give it to us? No. Intergenerational trauma, this is what I've learned from you, Seema. Intergenerational trauma requires intergenerational strategies. And that human rights lawyers are in the middle of an intergenerational strategy, and taking the long view about where we need to go should not be replaced by the failures that we inevitably experience. What we should be looking at is how we have managed to shift the political discourse, which makes it possible for the political solutions that we're calling for, and it also makes it possible for courts to be able to step out and feel like they can safely say, this is a genocide, this needs to be addressed.
Thank you very much, Vince. Thank you very much, Seema, and thank you very much, Mina. Actually, you can hear more from Seema and more from other actors from Namibia on Friday evening at 6:30. There will be an opening at the Berlin Gallery called Artco, Artco, and they will stream the event with Seema and others. So maybe for those of you who are interested in a deeper insight, for those of you who want to get a bit more of an explanation what is meant by success without victory, please plug into our discussion next Wednesday 24th. ECCHR is hosting an event and presenting a book of our friend Michael Redner, who passed away, Moving the Bar. And one of the main topics of this book is exactly the question how about the ambivalence and the limits of law, but how it still can be used by organizations like ours. So we are going to continue the conversation here in Berlin, but we will end the streaming here. But I don't want to end without thanking my colleagues Claire, Antonia, and for Maria, who supported this series. Who is interested can look all different parts of this series in our YouTube channel. And obviously a big thank to the team of Orca, who built up a little film studio here at ECCHR office. Hope you took something away from the discussion, and see you all hopefully very soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.